Before we jump into the story, make sure to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from. That night completely altered the course of everything in ways I could never have anticipated. What began as an ordinary evening with a simple request from my stepmom, Sophie, asking me to stay home while Mark left for his usual weekend fishing trip, quickly spiraled into something far more complicated. At the time, it seemed routine like any other weekend. After all, it was just the two of us most weekends anyway. What I didn't realize, however, was that this particular night would unravel in ways that would redefine the boundaries of our relationship, leaving an indelible mark on both of us, one that would linger long after. The house felt unusually quiet that morning, and it made me feel uneasy. The hum of Mark's presence, his laughter, the constant sound of his movements around the house was absent, leaving behind a strange and oppressive silence. I had just finished my homework and was ready to unwind, maybe play a video game or watch some TV, when Sophie called me into the living room. "Can you help me with something?" Her voice was softer than usual, almost too casual. I could sense a strange nervousness in her tone, but I couldn't figure out what was behind it. I hesitated for a second, unsure of what to expect. "Sure, what do you need?" I asked, walking toward where she was sitting, curiosity piquing my interest. Sophie had always been calm and composed, so when something felt off, it was hard to ignore. Yet I couldn't quite place what was different about her today. She smiled when I entered, but something was unsettling in her expression, something in her eyes that made my heart beat faster, a quiet intensity one hadn't noticed before. "Come sit down," she said, patting the cushion next to her. Her voice was light, but it had an undertone I couldn't shake. I obeyed, unsure of what to expect next, yet unable to stop the gnawing curiosity that had started to take hold of me. Sophie leaned back, crossing her legs, but her gaze never left mine. There was an intensity in her eyes that made me uncomfortable, and I couldn't figure out why. "You've grown up so much, you know," Sophie remarked, her voice soft, but carrying an unusual weight, as if her words meant more than what she was saying. Her eyes lingered on me for a beat too long, and the air between us felt thick with something unspoken. "You're not the little boy I used to know." Those words struck me like a punch. It wasn't like Sophie at all to say something so heavy, so laden with hidden meaning. Up until now, we had always shared a friendly, almost casual relationship, but today it felt different, uncomfortably so. Something about the way she said it made me feel exposed, like I was standing on the edge of something that I wasn't ready to face. "I guess," I mumbled, my voice unsure, not quite knowing how to respond. The air between us seemed to charge with tension. Sophie leaned in slightly, never breaking eye contact. "No, really," she pressed, her tone more insistent, her voice low and laced with something I couldn't identify. "You've changed, and I think we both know it." That sent a chill through me, and I couldn't help but shiver at the weight of her words. The atmosphere in the room shifted once again, the quiet, almost imperceptible pressure building around us. "Sophie, what are you trying to say?" I forced myself to ask, feeling a knot form in my stomach. I needed to know what was happening, why the air felt so thick with something unspoken between us. Sophie didn't respond immediately. Instead, she stared at me, her gaze steady, as if searching for the right words, as if she wasn't sure how to say what she needed to. Her eyes were searching mine, and I could see the hesitation, the struggle within her. Then, finally, she sighed and stood up, walking over to the window. She stared out into the yard for a moment, her back to me. "Mark's gone for the weekend," she said quietly, the words coming out more like a statement of fact than an explanation. "It's just the two of us here." I nodded, my stomach tightening, unsure where this conversation was leading, but feeling an undeniable tension begin to coil inside me. What was she getting at? She turned to face me, her expression unreadable, and the weight of her gaze settled on me. "You know, I've been thinking," she began, her voice steady but almost tender. "There are things I've wanted to talk to you about, things that I've never dared to say until now." The sound of her words caught in my throat, my heart pounding as I struggled to make sense of what was happening. "Like what?" I asked, my voice quieter than I intended. She took a slow, deliberate step closer to me, her eyes locking with mine in a way that made my pulse quicken. Like us, she said simply, her voice barely above a whisper. That one word hung in the air, heavy and full of implications I wasn't ready to confront. I felt my heart race, my mind scrambling to catch up. What did she mean by us? I tried to laugh it off, but it came out shaky, betraying the nervousness I felt. What do you mean, us? I asked, my words coming out more uncertain than I'd intended. Sophie smiled, but it wasn't the same warm, reassuring smile I was used to. This one was small, knowing, as though she was fully aware of something I had been ignoring. You've noticed it too, haven't you? She asked, her voice barely more than a murmur. The way things have changed between us. We're not just stepmother and stepson anymore. My mind was spinning now, trying to make sense of her words, trying to understand what was happening between us. But there was a deep, undeniable truth in what she said. I had felt it too. The way our relationship had shifted, how the small, subtle things, lingering glances, touches that lasted a moment too long, had started to mean something more. I had always tried to push those feelings away, convincing myself they weren't real, that I was imagining things. But now, hearing Sophie say it out loud, I knew there was no denying it any longer. I don't know what you're talking about. I lied, my voice barely a whisper, hoping she wouldn't press further. But Sophie stepped even closer, her presence overwhelming, and I could feel the weight of the moment closing in on me. Yes, you do, she said softly, her fingers brushing lightly against my arm. You felt it too. I stood up abruptly, stepping away from her, trying to regain some semblance of control. Sophie, this is crazy, I said, my voice trembling. You're my stepmom. We shouldn't. But Sophie didn't back down. She moved closer again, closing the distance between us, her gaze never leaving mine. Why not? She whispered, her voice low and intense, a dangerous edge creeping into her words. We're both adults. We don't have to follow anyone else's rules. The temptation to give in was almost overwhelming, and I felt myself being pulled toward her, despite my better judgment. No, this isn't right, I insisted, though even as I said the words, my resolve began to falter. But what if it is? She countered, her hand gently cupping my cheek, her touch sending a shockwave through me. The contact left me paralyzed, frozen in place as the world around us seemed to disappear. I wanted to stop, to push her away, to leave the room and pretend this moment never happened, but something inside me fought against the impulse. I couldn't move, couldn't break free from the gravitational pull of what was happening between us. The air was thick with something dangerous, something raw and undeniable. As the minutes passed, I realized that whatever had been between us before, the casual, comfortable dynamic of stepmother and stepson, was slipping away, replaced by something darker, more complicated, and far more intense. And I couldn't escape it. Neither of us could. I don't know what you're talking about. I lied, my voice barely a whisper. My words felt hollow, like a thin veil that couldn't possibly conceal the truth. Sophie stepped closer, closing the distance between us. Her presence was overwhelming, and I felt the room shrink around me as if the walls were closing in. Yes, you do, she said softly, her fingers grazing my arm in a way that sent a shockwave through me. You felt it too. I stood up abruptly, desperate to regain some control, to distance myself from the growing tension between us. Sophie, this is crazy, I said, my voice trembling, betraying the conflict inside me. You're my stepmom. We shouldn't. But she didn't back away. Instead, she followed me, her footsteps echoing in my mind like the inevitable approach of a storm. Why not? She whispered, her eyes smoldering with an intensity that made my heart race. We're both adults. We don't have to follow anyone else's rules. If you're still tuned into this video and find the story inspiring, drop a 1 in the comments to let me know you're still with me. I shook my head, trying to shake off the pull that seemed to be drawing me toward her, trying to resist the unexplainable attraction that had been simmering between us for months. No, this isn't right, I insisted, my voice strained with the effort to resist. But even as I spoke, I could feel my resolve crumbling, piece by piece. But what if it is? She countered, her hand reaching out to gently touch my cheek. The contact was electric, sending a jolt of heat through me. For a moment, I stood frozen, as if trapped in the web she was so effortlessly weaving around us. I wanted to say no, to push her away, to run out of the room and pretend this had never happened. But I couldn't. Something about this moment, about the way she looked at me, kept me rooted to the spot, and I hated myself for it. I hated how powerless I felt, and how much I was being drawn into something I knew I shouldn't be a part of. The tension in the house became unbearable after that. Every time I saw Sophie, I could feel the weight of our unspoken words, of everything we weren't saying, pressing down on me, suffocating me. It was as if every glance, every small interaction was charged with a meaning that neither of us was willing to acknowledge. But I didn't know how to confront it. I didn't know how to stop the slow, inevitable pull that seemed to be dragging us both towards something that was beyond our control, beyond reason. The days blurred together, each one feeling like a repeat of the last, each moment between us thick with unspoken tension. I tried to keep my distance, avoiding being alone with her whenever possible, but it wasn't easy. She always found a way to be near me, to make her presence felt, whether it was a touch on the arm or the way she looked at me from across the room. It was as if the universe itself had conspired to keep us connected, and no matter how hard I tried to push it away, it refused to go. Then came the night when everything changed. Mark was working late, and I found myself retreating to my room, hoping that if I stayed hidden long enough, the tension between us would dissipate, and things would somehow go back to normal. But deep down, I knew that wasn't going to happen. I could hear Sophie moving around downstairs, the faint sound of the TV playing softly in the background. The minutes ticked by slowly, each one adding weight to the silence that hung heavily over the house. The ticking of the clock on my wall was the only sound that seemed to fill the space, a constant reminder of how much time was passing. I thought about calling a friend, about making up an excuse to leave the house, but something kept me from picking up the phone. Instead, I found myself standing outside my room, listening to the eerie quiet that had settled over the house. It was too quiet, too still, and that's when I made the decision that would change everything. I walked downstairs, my feet feeling heavier with each step. Sophie was sitting on the couch, a glass of wine in her hand, her gaze distant as she stared at the TV. She didn't notice me at first, or maybe she did, but pretended not to. I hesitated at the bottom of the stairs, unsure of what to say or do, unsure of what I was even hoping to achieve by coming down. But then, she looked up, her eyes locking onto mine, and in that moment, I knew there was no turning back. "Couldn't sleep?" she asked, her voice soft, almost too casual. But there was something in the way she said it that made my pulse quicken, the same way it had that first day we'd shared a moment that now felt like a distant memory. "Yeah," I mumbled, not trusting myself to say anything more. I walked over to the couch, sitting down at the far end, leaving as much space between us as possible. But even with the physical distance, I could feel the tension between us, thick and unspoken. We sat in silence for what felt like hours, the only sound the quiet hum of the TV in the background. I could feel her eyes on me, her gaze lingering on me in a way that made my skin tingle. I didn't know how to break the silence without making things worse. But before I could say anything, she spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've been thinking about us," she said softly, the words like a spark in a room full of dry wood. My heart skipped a beat. I didn't want to hear this. "Sophie, we can't," I started, but she cut me off before I could finish. "Why not?" she asked, her eyes locking onto mine with a steady intensity. "Why are we pretending there's nothing between us when we both know there is?" Her words hit me like a punch to the gut, and I felt the wind rush out of me. I wanted to argue, to tell her she was wrong, that we couldn't do this, that we shouldn't go down this path. But the truth was I didn't have the strength to fight it anymore. I had felt it too, the pull, the attraction, the connection that had been growing stronger with each passing day. I had tried to ignore it, convince myself it wasn't real, that it was just a passing phase. But now, sitting here with her, I knew there was no denying it any longer. "We can't do this," I said, my voice weak and lacking conviction. Even as the words left my lips, I knew they were a lie. I was lying to her, lying to myself. Sophie leaned in closer, her hand resting on the cushion between us. "We're not doing anything wrong," she whispered, her voice low and intense, the words hanging in the air between us like an unspoken truth. "We're not hurting anyone?" I shook my head, trying to clear the fog that had settled over my thoughts. "But it's not right," I argued weakly, knowing full well that my words lacked the force to push her away. She reached out, her fingers brushing against mine, sending a jolt of electricity through me. "Who says what's right and what's wrong?" she asked, her voice steady, unwavering, her gaze never leaving mine. I swallowed hard, my heart pounding in my chest. I wanted to pull away, wanted to run, but I couldn't. I was frozen, caught in the intensity of the moment, trapped by the feelings I had been trying to deny for so long. "We don't have to follow anyone else's rules," she whispered, her fingers tracing slow, delicate patterns along the back of my hand. Each subtle touch sent shivers through my body, and I fought to hold myself together. "We can decide for ourselves what's right," she continued, her voice low and almost intimate. I closed my eyes, trying to block out the sound of her voice and the warmth of her touch, but it was no use. The walls I had carefully built around my emotions, the barriers I thought I had so firmly established, were crumbling piece by piece, and I had no idea how to stop it. Before I could find my words, before I could summon the strength to pull away from her and regain control, she leaned in closer, her breath warm against my ear. "Tell me you don't feel it too," she whispered, her lips grazing my skin with an intensity that made my heart skip a beat. Her words sent an electric jolt down my spine, and I hated how my body responded, how deeply I longed to give in. I opened my mouth to protest, to tell her that this was wrong, that we couldn't do this, but the words caught in my throat. Nothing came out. Instead, I found myself turning toward her, helplessly meeting her gaze. The moment stretched on, the tension between us thickening with each passing second. And then, without thinking, without planning, without the ability to resist any longer, I leaned in and kissed her. It started slow, tentative, as though we were both testing the waters, uncertain of what would come next. But the kiss quickly deepened, as if our desires could no longer be held back. The heat between us intensified, and we gave in to the passion that had been quietly building for so long. My hands moved instinctively to her waist, pulling her closer, while her fingers tangled in my hair, her touch urgent, needy. The world around us disappeared. Time slowed down, the space between us shrinking until it felt like there was nothing but the two of us, lost in the intensity of that moment. I knew it was wrong. I knew we were crossing a line that, once crossed, we could never return from. But even as the rational part of my mind screamed for me to stop, to pull away, I couldn't. I didn't want to stop. As the kiss deepened, my mind raced with conflicting thoughts and emotions. I knew this was dangerous, knew that we were playing with fire, but there was also a part of me, a part one couldn't ignore, that didn't care. A part of me that had wanted this for so long, longer than I was willing to admit even to myself. When we finally pulled apart, both of us breathless, our faces only inches apart, the weight of what had just happened settled heavily in the air. Her eyes were dark, filled with something intense that I couldn't quite name. At that moment, I realized that nothing would ever be the same between us. "I've wanted this for so long," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion, her breath warm against my skin. "And I know you have too." I didn't respond. I couldn't. The truth was too overwhelming, too raw. It was too much for me to process at that moment. Instead, I just nodded, my heart racing in my chest as the gravity of what we had just done sank in. But even then, I knew this wasn't over. The kiss, that one singular moment of surrender, had only been the beginning. There would be more. There would always be more. After that night, everything between us changed. Every time I saw Sophie, I couldn't look at her the same way. Each time our eyes met, a rush of heat coursed through my veins, reminding me of what we had done, and of the unspoken promise that there was more to come. The air in the house felt thick, charged with something dangerous, something we both understood but dared not acknowledge openly. Days passed in strained, uncomfortable silence. I did my best to keep my distance, but it was impossible to avoid her entirely. Every touch, every passing glance felt like a spark, a reminder of the tension that simmered just beneath the surface, ready to erupt at any moment. I knew what we were doing wasn't right. I knew this was dangerous, but there was an undeniable pull between us, something magnetic and inescapable. No matter how hard I tried, I couldn't ignore it. One afternoon, when Mark was out again, the silence in the house felt unbearable. I was pacing the living room, trying to distract myself by flicking through the channels on the TV, but my mind kept drifting back to her, the memory of that kiss, the feel of her lips against mine, the way my heart had raced in that instant. It was all too much. I hated myself for thinking about it, but no matter how hard I tried to push it away, I couldn't stop. Just when I thought I might lose my mind, I heard the sound of footsteps behind me. I turned around and found Sophie standing in the doorway, her face unreadable. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The tension in the room was palpable, thick with everything we hadn't said yet, everything that hung between us, unspoken but understood. "We need to talk," she said, her voice low and hesitant, almost reluctant. I nodded, knowing this conversation was inevitable, even if I wasn't ready for it. "Yeah," I replied, my voice tight in my throat. "We do?" She sat down on the couch with a long sigh, and I followed, sitting across from her, keeping a careful distance. My heart pounded in my chest, my mind a whirlwind of conflicting thoughts. I didn't know where to begin, didn't know what to say to make any of this better, to undo what had already been done. "I know things have been different," she started, her hands folded tightly in her lap. "And I don't want you to feel uncomfortable. That's the last thing I want." I swallowed hard, my throat dry. "I don't know what to feel," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "I mean, this isn't normal, right? We're not supposed to feel this way." Sophie looked down at her hands, her expression troubled. "I know," she said softly, "but it's not something we can just ignore either. Can we?" I didn't have an answer for her. The truth was, I didn't know what we were supposed to do. Everything about this felt wrong, but at the same time, there was a part of me that didn't want it to stop. I couldn't explain it, couldn't rationalize it, but the feelings were there, undeniable and real. She shifted slightly on the couch, leaning forward as if to close the space between us. "I think about that night all the time," she confessed, her voice barely audible. "I can't stop thinking about it." My breath hitched in my throat. I wanted to tell her that I thought about it too, that it haunted me every moment of every day, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I just nodded, my heart pounding against my chest. There was a long silence, the weight of everything we weren't saying hanging heavily between us. I could feel the tension building again, that same dangerous pull that had led us here in the first place. And then, before I could stop myself, I said, "I think about it too." The words slipped from my mouth before I could stop them, and once they were spoken, there was no taking them back. Sophie's eyes met mine, and at that moment, I knew there was no going back. We had crossed the line, and now we were standing on the edge of something even more dangerous. If you're still tuned into this video and find the story inspiring, drop a 2 in the comments to let me know you're still with me. She didn't say anything at first, but the look in her eyes told me everything I needed to know. There was a heat there, a need that mirrored my own, and it terrified me. But at the same time, it thrilled me in a way that I couldn't deny. "We can't keep doing this," I said, my voice shaky, unsure. Though even as I said it, I wasn't sure I believed it. Sophie's gaze didn't waver. "I know," she whispered, almost tenderly, "but we're already here, aren't we?" The room felt smaller, the air thicker with the weight of our unspoken desire. I wanted to run, wanted to put as much distance between us as I could, but I couldn't move. I was trapped, not by her, but by my desires. The pull between us was too strong, too overwhelming to resist. Before I could make a move, she leaned in closer, her face inches from mine. I could feel her breath on my skin, soft and warm, and my heart raced uncontrollably in my chest. For a brief, fleeting moment, I thought I might be able to stop it, pull away, and end this madness before it went any further. But then her lips were on mine again, and all rational thought fled. The kiss wasn't tentative this time. It wasn't uncertain. It was full of the tension we had both been holding back for so long, the desire we couldn't ignore any longer. I kissed her back, my hands gripping the couch beneath me as if holding on to something, anything, that could keep me grounded. This kiss wasn't about love, about affection, about tenderness. It was about need, raw, primal need. A need that neither of us could control, no matter how much we tried to fight it. My heart pounded in my chest, my mind a blur. When we finally pulled apart, both of us were breathless, our foreheads resting together in a quiet moment of shared tension. The weight of what we had just done hung heavily in the air, an unspoken truth that neither of us dared to voice. Still, neither of us made a move to break the silence. There was no retreat, no escape from this fragile moment we had created. "We have to stop," I murmured again, though my voice was weak, trembling with uncertainty. My words lacked the strength they once would have held, the conviction all but evaporated in the heat of the moment. Sophie nodded, her breath warm against my skin, her body still so close to mine that I could feel the thrum of her heartbeat. "I know," she whispered, her voice thick with something I couldn't quite identify, but which made my pulse quicken. "But it's so hard, isn't it?" I didn't respond. What could I say? The truth was too complicated, too raw, too overwhelming. We were caught in a web we had spun together, a web that seemed to tighten with every word, with every touch. No matter how much we told ourselves that we needed to stop, the pull between us was too strong, too undeniable. It had already begun, and no matter how many times we tried to deny it, we kept coming back to each other. Then, in the quiet space between us, it happened again. Sophie leaned into me once more, her face inches from mine, her lips so close I could feel the warmth of her breath on my skin. We couldn't resist. Not anymore. It was like a spark igniting a flame, and as quickly as it had started, we were consumed by it. I think I was caught in the thrill, in the reckless excitement of it all. But Sophie, she didn't seem to care about the consequences. Afterward, she smiled at me, a quiet, knowing smile that spoke volumes. It wasn't a smile of regret or guilt. It was a smile of satisfaction, of something deeper than mere physical desire. And in that moment, I hated myself for feeling the same way. I hated that I couldn't stop thinking about it, about how much I had wanted it, how much I still wanted her. The next few days passed in a blur. We tried to act as though nothing had changed, as though everything between us was normal. But it was impossible to ignore the tension. Every time I saw Sophie, I felt that rush of heat, the same dangerous pull that had led us down this path in the first place. It was like we were circling each other, both of us waiting for the moment when we would finally give in again. And I knew it was only a matter of time. One evening, Mark was out late again for work, and I found myself in the kitchen trying to distract myself by making dinner. The silence in the house felt oppressive, like a weight I couldn't shake. Every sound seemed amplified, reminding me of the weight of what we were doing, the enormity of what was at stake. I was trying to focus on the task at hand, but my mind kept drifting back to Sophie, to the memory of her touch, the feel of her lips against mine. I couldn't block it out, no matter how hard I tried. I didn't hear her approach at first, but when I turned around, there she was standing in the doorway, leaning against the frame, watching me with that same unreadable expression. The way her eyes locked onto mine made my pulse spike. She was so close, yet still so far away. "Need any help?" she asked, her voice casual, though I could hear the undercurrent of something else beneath the surface. It made my pulse quicken, like a warning bell I couldn't ignore. "No, I'm good," I said, though my hands were shaking, betraying the calmness I tried to project. Sophie walked over to me, her presence overwhelming. She was too close, her proximity making it impossible to think clearly, impossible to stay composed. "Are you sure?" she pressed, her voice soft, but there was an unmistakable heat in it. I swallowed hard, trying to steady myself, trying to find the strength to push back. "Sophie, we can't," I started, my voice faltering, but she interrupted me, her words a quiet, inevitable truth. "We don't have to do anything," she said, her eyes never leaving mine. "But I think we both know where this is going." Her words hung between us like a weight, an undeniable truth that neither of us could deny. I wanted to argue, wanted to tell her that she was wrong, that this wasn't right, but I couldn't. Deep down, I knew she was right. We were already here, caught in this thing we couldn't undo. We stood there in silence for a moment, the space between us shrinking with every passing second. And then, without a single word, Sophie kissed me again. It was quick, almost fleeting, but it was enough to ignite everything we had been trying so hard to hold back. My heart pounded in my chest, and I knew this was only the beginning. We had crossed the line, and now there was no going back. The weeks that followed were a blur of stolen moments and furtive glances. It felt like we were living in two different worlds, one where everything seemed normal, and another where Sophie and I were constantly on the verge of something we couldn't control. Our secret loomed over us, heavy and oppressive. Every time Mark left for work or stayed out late, the tension between us grew thicker. I'd find myself in the same room as Sophie, and without a word spoken, we both knew what would happen next. It was terrifying how easily we had slipped into this. Every touch, every look felt like we were crossing some invisible boundary, and yet neither of us pulled back. We were drawn together like magnets, the pull between us undeniable, a force neither of us could fight. We didn't have to say it, but we both knew this couldn't last. But for now, neither of us was willing to stop. One Saturday afternoon, I woke up with the unmistakable sense that something was about to happen. The air in the house felt thick with anticipation. Mark was at a company event, and I knew he wouldn't be back until late. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were standing on the edge of something we wouldn't be able to come back from. Sophie was in the kitchen when I walked in. She was washing dishes, her back turned to me, but she must have known I was there because she didn't flinch when I entered. I stood by the door for a moment, watching her, unsure of what to do or say. This had become our routine now, this strange, unspoken dance we were caught in, the same steps we both knew all too well. She turned off the faucet and wiped her hands on a towel before finally facing me. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence was loud and heavy with everything we weren't saying. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice soft, her eyes searching mine as though looking for an answer she wasn't sure she would find. I wasn't. I hadn't been for a while, but how could I admit that? How could I explain the storm that raged inside me? The battle between what was right and what I was feeling. I wanted to say something, to explain, but I couldn't. Instead, I just mumbled, "I don't know." Sophie stepped closer, stopping just a few feet away. Her presence was overwhelming and comforting, but dangerous all at once. "I've been thinking," she said slowly, her voice careful, deliberate. "Maybe we should talk about what's been happening." I tensed, a knot forming in my stomach. What was there to talk about? Hadn't our actions already said everything? But she wasn't backing down, and I knew I couldn't avoid this conversation forever. "What's there to talk about?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady, though I could feel my heart racing. If you're still tuned into this video and find the story inspiring, drop a 4 in the comments to let me know you're still with me. She sighed, rubbing her forehead with the back of her hand, a nervous gesture that betrayed the calm she was trying to project. "I don't know, maybe we need to figure out where this is going. We can't keep living like this, pretending it's not happening." She was right, but I didn't want to hear it. I didn't want to face the truth of what was happening between us. "Where do you think it's going?" I asked, my voice sharp, edged with something I couldn't hide. Sophie flinched slightly at the tone, but she didn't break eye contact. She didn't need to. We both knew we were in uncharted waters, and neither of us had the answers. The only thing we knew for sure was that there was no turning back now. "I don't know," she admitted, her voice soft, almost fragile. "But I do know that we can't keep tiptoeing around it." Frustration surged inside me, and I ran a hand through my hair, trying to suppress the emotions I wasn't ready to face. It felt like my mind was a storm, each thought crashing into the next, and I couldn't find the clarity I needed. "What do you want from me?" I snapped, my voice harsher than I intended. It wasn't anger at her. It was frustration with myself, with the situation, with everything. Do you want me to just say that this is okay? That I'm fine with it? Because I'm not. I'm not fine with any of this. Her expression softened at my outburst, her gaze tender and filled with something that felt like understanding. She stepped closer, closing the small gap between us, her presence both soothing and terrifying. I don't want you to be fine with it, she said quietly, her voice gentle yet resolute. I just want you to be honest with yourself. With me? Her words hit me like a punch to the gut, and I felt something break inside me. She was right, of course. She was always right in the way she saw through me, knew what I was trying to hide, what I was so desperately trying to deny. I had been lying to myself for so long, convincing myself that this was just a phase and that it would eventually go away if I ignored it long enough. But the truth was inescapable. I couldn't stop thinking about her. I couldn't stop wanting her. And the more I tried to fight it, the more powerful it became. I don't know how to do that, I admitted, my voice cracking as I spoke. The vulnerability in my words was something I had tried so hard to protect, but it had slipped through my defenses. I don't know how to be honest about this. Sophie reached out, her hand finding my arm with a gentleness that sent a shiver down my spine. I hated how much I craved that touch, and how much it affected me when I knew it wasn't something I should want. It's okay, she whispered, her eyes filled with understanding and something deeper, something I wasn't sure I was ready to face. We'll figure it out together. The sincerity in her voice broke something inside me, and before I could stop myself, I pulled her closer. The kiss that followed was unlike any other, slow, deliberate, not rushed or desperate. It was as though we were trying to hold on to something slipping through our fingers, trying to grasp something we knew we couldn't keep. When we finally pulled apart, her forehead rested against mine, and we stood there in silence, our breaths mingling in the small space between us. I could feel the rapid beat of her heart, matching the frantic rhythm of my own. "What are we doing?" I whispered, my words barely audible. "I don't know," she replied softly, her voice almost a breath. "But I can't stop." Neither could I. As the days passed, we fell deeper into whatever this was, this messy, tangled thing that we couldn't define. The moments we shared grew more intense and more frequent, until it felt like the only time I was truly myself was when I was with her. Even if everything else in my life felt like a lie, with her, I was real. I knew it couldn't last. I knew that something had to give, that we couldn't keep pretending forever. But I wasn't ready to face that truth, not yet. Then, one evening, everything came crashing down. I was sitting in the living room, the TV on, but muted, my thoughts a jumbled mess. Sophie was upstairs, and Mark was supposed to be out late again, but I wasn't paying attention to the time. I was too lost in my head, replaying everything we had done, everything we couldn't undo. The sound of the front door opening snapped me out of my thoughts, and panic surged through me like a wave. I hadn't expected Mark to come home this early. I froze for a moment, my body tense, my mind racing as I scrambled to stand up. But before I could react, Mark was already walking into the living room, his eyes scanning the room before landing on me. "Hey," he said, his voice casual, but there was something in it I couldn't quite place, a tone that made my stomach tighten. "What are you doing?" "Just watching TV," I replied quickly, my voice tight, trying to mask the panic. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, the guilt clawing at me from the inside out. Mark didn't seem to notice, or maybe he was choosing not to acknowledge the tension in the room. He sat down on the couch, flipping through the channels as if nothing was wrong. I tried to calm myself, to tell myself everything was fine, but the weight of the secret we were carrying was suffocating. The tension in the room was palpable, and I couldn't escape it. Sophie came down the stairs a few minutes later, her expression carefully neutral. She greeted Mark with a casual smile, but I could see the subtle shift in her demeanor. The way her hands fidgeted at her sides, the way her eyes avoided meeting mine. Dinner that night was an exercise in restraint. The conversation was stiff and strained, and every time Mark spoke, I felt the walls closing in around me. I couldn't meet Sophie's gaze. I couldn't focus on anything but the knot of fear tightening in my chest. I thought we might make it through the evening without incident, that we might manage to keep up the facade for just one more night. But as we were clearing the table, Mark suddenly turned to me, his gaze unreadable. "You've been spending a lot of time with Sophie lately," he said, his voice calm, but there was a subtle probing undertone that made my stomach drop. My heart stopped. I glanced at Sophie, who had gone pale, her eyes wide with fear. The air in the room thickened, and I could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on me. I stammered, struggling to keep my voice steady, but the words seemed to catch in my throat. Mark's gaze lingered on me for a long moment, and I could feel the tension in the room shift, an almost tangible weight that seemed to tighten around my chest. "Anything you want to tell me?" he asked, his tone still casual, but now it was laced with something darker, something that made my blood run cold. I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came out. My mind was spinning, searching for a way to deflect, to say anything that might make this go away. But there were no words, no excuses I could offer. I couldn't lie, not when the truth was hanging in the air, so close to being exposed. Sophie's hand brushed mine under the table, a silent plea for me to say something, anything. But it only made the guilt worse, the weight of her touch pressing down on me even more. "No," I finally whispered, my voice barely audible. "Nothing." Mark didn't say anything for what felt like an eternity, just staring at me with those unreadable eyes. And in that silence, I knew. He knew. The truth was already out there, unspoken but undeniable. As I stood there, feeling the weight of his gaze pressing down on me, I realized there was no escaping what had already begun. The words we hadn't spoken didn't matter. The truth was there, in the air between us, and it would follow me, no matter how hard I tried to outrun it. As we come to the end of this story, I want to ask you, what have you learned so far? Relationships are complex, and the emotions we experience can sometimes lead us down unexpected paths. It's important to understand the power of our choices and the consequences they bring. Now, I'd love to hear from you. What is one thing you've learned from this story that you'll bring into your own life? Leave a comment below, and let's keep the conversation going. If you like this video, please leave your comment below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel so you don't miss out on future videos. Thanks for watching, and I look forward to hearing from you.